11:42 a.m., July 18, 1944. East of St. Lo, Normandy. Private First Class Walter Lint Kessler lay belly down in a drainage ditch carved by centuries of rainwater and cartwheels. Its mud black as coal dust and its waterline barely deep enough to hide a man. He kept his chin pressed into the muck, eyes just above the rim, studying the German observation post that dominated the open pasture to his front. He did not move. He barely breathed. In the still air of a late July noon, even breath shimmered if the light caught it at the wrong angle. The numbers were not in his favor. The far hedgerow lay 4,900 yards away, a distance so absurd for a scout to cross under fire that no Doctrine bothered to address it. The German OP sat in the remains of a stone farmhouse. One collapsed wall, one intact loft window, one narrow firing slit hacked through a timber support. Inside it, the enemy watchers had Zeiss 10x80 binoculars powerful enough to track a man's fingers at half a mile. Their guns were worse. 2 MG-42s mounted on tripods, barrel jackets angled across overlapping kill fields. Behind them waited an 80mm mortar team with pre-sighted range cards. Kessler knew their drill. Spot movement, shout bearing, fire within 10 seconds. No adjustment needed. The pasture had been measured long before the Americans reached this line. For 3 weeks now, the 2nd Infantry Division had been stalled at this precise stretch of Norman earth. 3 weeks of hedgerow to hedgerow fighting. 3 weeks of scouts attempting to cross this pasture under cover of early morning haze, late evening shadow, or brief artillery smoke. 3 weeks of identical outcomes. Every attempt ended in casualties inside 40 seconds. The survivors were dragged back after nightfall, silent, shaken, unwilling to describe what the MG-42 rounds had done to the men caught in the open. There were no landmarks to hide behind. No dips shallow enough to shelter a crawl. No vegetation high enough to break the line of sight. The terrain itself announced the verdict. Anyone who moved across it by day would die on it. Doctrine left no ambiguity. Don't move by day in open terrain. Delay until night infiltration. Maintain concealment above all else. Kessler had memorized these lines at Fort Benning just like everyone else. And like everyone else, he knew none of them mattered now. Higher command had set the assault for 1,200 hours. Artillery, armor, and infantry were linked to that timeline. Air support, too. If the scouts failed to reach the far hedgerow before the barrage began, the entire attack would advance blind. Without the green flare marking German fallback trenches, the regiment would walk straight into interlocking fire. Not theory, certainty. The last intelligence officer to check the maps had said as much under his breath. No flare, no advance. No advance, no breakthrough. Kessler checked his watch. 9 minutes until everything collapsed. He wiped a sleeve across his face, smearing the dirt rather than cleaning it. Staying clean was no longer the goal. The goal was becoming something the Germans would not recognize as human. For months he had watched how livestock behaved in these Norman fields: milk cows, draft horses, the occasional wandering goat. They walked with uneven rhythm. They stopped without pattern. Their outlines shifted constantly as the wind pushed their coats and tails. The Germans rarely paid attention to them. That observation mattered more now than any rifle skill he possessed. He slowly raised his head another fraction of an inch, just enough to see the pasture's surface. The sun was unforgiving, directly overhead, flattening shadows into absence. Grass barely higher than his knuckles rippled in faint waves from a breeze drifting east to west. Beyond that, nothing. Not a single depression deep enough to crawl into. No irrigation ruts, no abandoned equipment. Just a broad, sunlit expanse that might as well have been drawn with a compass and ruler. The field stank faintly of manure and dried clover. Heat built inside his helmet 3 degrees at a time. A fly landed on the bridge of his nose. He ignored it. In the German OP, one of the binoculars shifted slightly, just a few degrees, tracing a slow, methodical scan pattern from north fence line to south stone wall. Kessler could track its rhythm. 7 seconds left, then the glass would cross his ditch again. He lowered his eyes. 7 seconds were survivable. 7 seconds were predictable. The next 9 minutes were not. He glanced at his gear. His rifle lay beside him, tucked deep into the ditch where no reflection could betray him. In his left breast pocket sat the single object that mattered, a green signal flare, wrapped in cloth to dampen sound. He would need to fire it into the sky the moment he reached the far hedgerow, if he reached it at all. Infantry timing depended on that streak of green. Artillery timing, too. If he fired late, men would die because of his delay. If he fired early, they would die walking into the wrong trench. Precision mattered. Survival mattered more, but barely. Kessler made his decision without speaking. He stripped his gear off piece by piece, leaving only what he absolutely needed. He scooped handfuls of ditch mud, thick, heavy, nearly black, and spread it across his sleeves, neck, cheekbones, and helmet netting. He rolled onto his side, coated his trousers, then pressed himself full length into the muck. The mud absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It broke up the straight lines of fabric. It turned him into a dark, irregular shape with no sharp edges. He became something else, something the German eye might ignore. He slid forward until his chest reached the lip of the ditch. The sun pressed on his back. The German scanned again. Kessler waited for the precise moment their binoculars swept past the ditch and turned toward the southern fence line. His heart stayed low and steady, as if refusing to acknowledge the stakes. When the lens drifted away, he moved. Not fast, not slow. A single, irregular lurch, 6 inches of motion, then stillness. Another lurch, another pause. A movement pattern mimicking a grazing animal rather than a crawling man. His outline blurred into the field's mottled colors. At 30 yards, he was no longer clearly visible. At 50, he ceased to look like a person at all. Behind him, the ditch lay empty. Ahead of him stretched the pasture of death. Kessler pressed himself into the ground and kept crawling toward it. Private First Class Walter Lint Kessler had never been the kind of soldier anyone expected to matter in a battle plan. He was small-boned, narrow-shouldered, quiet to the point of vanishing. In a company of loud farm boys, steel mill laborers, and New England fishermen, he moved like a shadow crossing a wall, always present, rarely noticed. Even before Normandy, most men simply walked past him without comment, assuming he was just another rifleman carrying more weight than muscle. Kessler grew up in the timber country of northern Pennsylvania, in a logging camp where mud was constant, fog was seasonal, and silence was the first skill a boy learned. His father worked felling crews. His older brothers ran saws. Walter learned something different. He learned how to move through brush without snapping a twig. He learned how to track mule teams by the wetness of their prints. He learned how to read soil not as ground, but as a language. Dents, scratches, pressure spots, moisture lines. Details others ignored, he treated as instructions. By the time he enlisted in 1942, those habits were set into his bones. Infantry replacement training did not approve. The cadre wanted aggression, volume, boldness. Kessler offered none of that. His marksmanship scores hovered in the middle. His bayonet drills were adequate. His physical fitness test was neither good nor bad. Yet during field exercises, he did something the instructors could not ignore. He disappeared into terrain without trying. During a night infiltration course, the evaluators lost sight of him entirely for 15 minutes. They found him lying under a patch of thorns, observing the mock enemy position in complete stillness. He had chosen silence over speed, patience over bravado. It unsettled them. When he reached the 2nd Infantry Division in England, his platoon reacted the same way the instructors had. They called him Lint, not as an insult, but because he stuck to the edges of things. He walked behind hedgerows instead of on roads. He read the ground before stepping on it. He stopped abruptly to study depressions in mud or the angle of a broken branch. Most thought it was nerves. A few thought it was eccentricity. Only one man saw method in it. Lieutenant Thomas Markham was 26 years old, a former forestry student who understood the difference between a careless footprint and a deliberate one. He watched Kessler study the ground, watched him predict rain changes, watched him avoid exposed positions without being told. One morning, during a routine patrol near Cirrisi Forest, Markham motioned to the squad to halt. They had nearly walked into a German outpost concealed behind a bramble wall. The only reason they stopped in time was because Kessler had lifted a hand, a small gesture, barely noticeable, and pointed to a patch of crushed nettles bending the wrong direction. After that, Markham appointed him assistant scout. By the time the division landed in Normandy in early June 1944, Kessler had learned to carry his role like weight on his shoulders. Scouts were the first men forward and the first to die. Their casualty rate was the highest in the regiment. In some battalions, 1 in 3 scouts never reached the next hedgerow. But Kessler did not question the assignment. He accepted it with the same quiet pragmatism he applied to everything else. The hedgerow fighting shaped him further. Normandy was a maze. Fields boxed by earth banks, trenches hidden under thorn, German machine gun nests waiting behind every corner. Scouts lived by inches and seconds. They moved when the wind rustled leaves. They breathed through cloth to avoid emitting visible vapor. They studied shadows the way gunners studied tracers. Kessler excelled at this. He did not rush. He did not fear silence. He treated each hedgerow as if it were the first one he had ever seen. But the open pasture east of St. Lo was something different. Scouts trained to slip between gaps, not across miles of exposed earth. The division's advance had slowed to a crawl. Every commander knew that the German OP defined the battlefield. No smokescreen, no feint, no diversion changed anything. Every time the Americans tried to send forward observers across that pasture, the Germans proved their mastery of daylight engagement. 40 seconds, sometimes less. The morning before the assault was scheduled, Markham gathered the remaining scouts. Their nerves were worn thin. 2 of them had been wounded in the past week. 1 walked with a limp. The lieutenant explained the timeline. Artillery at 1200 hours, infantry push immediately after, tanks advancing only if the far hedgerow was marked. "We need someone across the field," he said. "We need eyes on their fallback trenches." Silence filled the hedgerow. No one volunteered. Kessler was crouched at the edge of the ditch, watching sunlight shift on the pasture. He lifted his hand without looking back. Markham stared at him. "You saw what happened to the last 3 men." Kessler nodded once. "You think you can make it?" Another nod. No bravado, no emotion, just observant certainty, as if he were noting the slope of a hillside or the depth of a footprint. None of the others understood what he meant. Only later, when they watched him smear mud across his arms and helmet, did they realize he intended something no manual had ever taught, and no officer had ever approved. Before stepping forward, He said the closest thing to a philosophy he possessed. The ground hides you if you listen to it. Then he turned toward the pasture, alone. The idea did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as observation. Quiet, incremental, accumulated over days of watching the pasture and the creatures that moved within it. Kessler had spent every spare moment in that drainage ditch, studying the German OP the way a carpenter studies a warped beam. Slowly, methodically, waiting for something to reveal itself. The pasture contained no secrets. That was the problem. It was flat, open, and honest. Grass barely reached a man's knuckles. The creek line cut a shallow arc through its center, no deeper than a helmet bowl. Cows from nearby farms wandered through it sometimes, indifferent to artillery and machine gun fire. They walked across the open ground without hesitation, their hooves brushing grass in slow, careless arcs. The Germans ignored them completely. That fact bothered Kessler. On the morning of July 18th, a milk cow drifted toward the creek bed. Kessler watched it move. The Germans did not react. The cow ambled into the mud pit beside the water, rolled once, then stood again coated in a thick layer of black muck. Something changed, not in the cow but in the light around it. The shine on its hide disappeared. Edges softened, flies dispersed. Mud absorbed brightness. It swallowed sharp lines. It removed definition. Kessler whispered the observation to himself. Light sticks to dry things, slides off wet things. It was something his father had once said about tracking deer in early spring. He watched the cow again. When it walked through the pasture, its outline broke into irregular patches. From a distance, it looked like a modeled shape with no symmetry. If someone had drawn a human silhouette beside it, the cow's motion would register as organic, the human's as artificial. The German OP had no difficulty spotting artificial motion. By mid-morning, Kessler understood the problem with every scout attempt so far. Soldiers crawled with intention, their movements steady, linear, determined. Human minds produced patterns. Patterns attracted attention. Cows did not crawl. They drifted. They paused. They shifted weight unevenly. Their gait lacked rhythm. Their forms lacked angles. Kessler studied his own sleeves. Dry fabric reflected sunlight. Wet mud absorbed it. He rubbed moist earth across his forearm and watched the brightness vanish. He pressed mud into the netting of his helmet and saw his head shape blur. He rolled a bit more mud into his cheekbones, obscuring reflective oils in his skin. A ridiculous idea, he thought. Absurd. But so was crossing 4,900 yards of open ground with German gunners watching through Zeiss binoculars. Shortly before 11:42 a.m., he stripped down to his undershirt. He set his rifle aside. His boots sank into the ditch floor as he knelt and scooped handfuls of mud. Cold, gritty, viscous. He pressed it onto his sleeves, his trousers, the back of his hands. He smeared it across his helmet until his fingers disappeared into the same color as the soil. He packed it under his chin, over his neck, into the folds of his collar. The mud was heavy. It pulled at his clothing, but it also dulled every sheen, every edge, every contour. He became, literally, part of the ditch. Lieutenant Markham crouched beside him. "You sure about this, Lint?" Kessler nodded once. "It won't work," Markham murmured, not as dismissal, but as fear. "Maybe," Kessler said. One word, quiet, neutral, a statement of probability, not confidence. He checked the German OP again. The binoculars swept the field in slow arcs, north, center, south, repeating every 20 seconds. He counted the timing under his breath. He listened to the MG-42's clack as gunners swapped barrels. He watched the mortar crew idle behind their parapet. Helmets tipped back, bored, comfortable, deadly. When the binoculars drifted to the southern fence line, Kessler moved. He rolled fully into the ditch mud until he looked like a dark, shapeless clump of earth. He pushed himself forward, chest scraping the ground. The first motion covered maybe 6 inches. Then he froze, waited, listened. The OP did not react. He moved again, an inch this time, then another inch, then stillness. The movement pattern was intentional, but not rhythmic. He mimicked the inconsistent shifts of a grazing animal, tiny motions, unpredictable pauses, irregular weight changes. If a human observer expected a soldier to crawl, the pattern would appear wrong. Wrong enough, perhaps, to register as something other than a man. Kessler reached the lip of the ditch. Sunlight hit him full across the back. He could feel the warmth through the mud-caked fabric. He could feel flies buzzing around him, landing, lifting off, returning. His breath stayed shallow. His elbows dug into soil that smelled of manure and rainstorms long past. He waited for the scanning lens to complete its next pass. When it turned away again, he slid out of the ditch and into the open. Markham watched him go. Watched him transform from a man to a low, dark mass creeping through grass. The lieutenant whispered a line he would later repeat in every after-action interview. "I thought I was watching a dead man." But the Germans did not fire. Kessler moved another few inches, then another. He became smaller, dimmer, less defined. At 50 yards, he no longer resembled a human shape. By 70 yards, he had ceased to resemble anything familiar at all. For the first time in 3 weeks, something crossed the pasture without dying. For the first 50 yards, Kessler moved by instinct alone. Not training, instinct. Training taught soldiers to crawl in straight lines, maximize speed, hug the ground, minimize silhouette. But instinct told him that straight lines were predictable, and predictability under a German OP meant death measured in seconds. So he crawled as no soldier had been taught to crawl. His path wavered slightly left, then corrected itself. He stopped for intervals that did not match any known pattern. 3 seconds, 10 seconds, 1 second, 7 seconds. He shifted his weight unevenly, dragging a knee or shoulder forward without symmetry. A cow, not a man. At 70 yards, he paused. The grass hit him more than he expected. Laying flat, the blades rose to his ears. The mud on his arms darkened as it dried. He pressed more soil into the cracks. He risked a glance toward the OP. The German binoculars swept the southern fence line, then drifted toward the center of the field. Kessler froze. The lens approached his position, then crossed it without a hitch. No reaction. No movement from the MG-42 crews. No sudden scramble from the mortar pit. He had not been seen. He resumed crawling. Behind him, the American line remained quiet. No one dared speak. No one dared lift their heads. The company's senior NCOs watched Kessler move with disbelief. They knew the numbers. No scout had survived more than 40 seconds in this field. It had been the hardest ground the 2nd Infantry Division had encountered since Omaha. Officers had considered bypassing it entirely until aerial reconnaissance confirmed that the far hedgerow covered a German secondary trench system that threatened the division's right flank. The pasture was unavoidable, but no one imagined crossing it at midday. At 120 yards, Kessler reached the shallow creek bed. The mud thickened, becoming adhesive, sucking at his elbows and knees. He lowered himself deeper, letting the water soak him until the mud began to glisten again, reflective in patches, but in an uneven, organic pattern. Wetness broke up shape. Dryness created outline. He moved through the creek slowly, using the water's murkiness to refresh his camouflage. When he emerged on the far bank, he looked less like a soldier and more like a creature dredged from river-bottom silt. The German OP scanned again. Kessler felt the movement before he saw it. A subtle shift in the air, a flicker of motion at the edge of peripheral vision. He dropped flat. 10 seconds passed. 20 seconds. The binoculars lingered in his general direction. He wondered if a glint had betrayed him. A droplet of water, a bit of metal, a bead of sweat. His heartbeat remained steady, more from habit than calm. Finally, the lens drifted away. He exhaled through the grass. The next stretch, 2,000 yards of uninterrupted field, was the true test. No creek, no ditch, no ripples in terrain. Just a long, slow incline toward the distant hedgerow, the one he needed to reach before 1200 hours. He checked the sun angle. He had eaten nearly 10 minutes already. The assault clock was shrinking. He crawled. At 200 yards, insects began to treat him as part of the environment. Grasshoppers landed on his sleeves. Ants marched across his helmet. A beetle crawled up his collar, paused, turned, and then continued across his cheekbone. He did not react. Reaction was movement, and movement was death. The pasture warmed under the sun. Heat radiated upward, turning the space between soil and sky into a shimmering veil. That veil worked for him and against him. It blurred his outline but increased the Germans' reliance on high-quality optics. Zeiss glass cut through heat distortions better than American lenses. The OP's watchers had the advantage. At 300 yards, an MG-42 clattered briefly. Test firing, not at him. But the sound vibrated through his ribs like a raw nerve. He lowered himself further into the grass and waited for dust to settle. He resumed crawling. At 500 yards, he realized something unexpected. He was learning the pasture's rhythm. The German OP followed a strict pattern. Late war efficiency showing through fatigue. Each scan took roughly 20 seconds. Each pause lasted 5. Every minute or so, one of the binocular operators stepped back to rest his eyes, creating a gap in coverage. Kessler began timing his movements to those gaps, lengthening his crawls for brief spurts when the OP's focus weakened. By 600 yards, he was no longer simply moving. He was competing against trained observers, matching their cycles, exploiting their fatigue, threading himself between moments. No manual had taught him this. No doctrine had prepared him for it. But doctrine did not matter now. He had become, in effect, a reconnaissance phantom creeping across a battlefield, built to kill anything that moved. At 700 yards, a gust of wind rippled the grass. Perfect timing. Kessler moved nearly 2 full feet before the blade settled. The OP did not react. His confidence did not increase. Confidence was pointless. But he recognized opportunity when it presented itself. At 800 yards, the wind died. The pasture became still again. He froze. For a brief moment, the battlefield held its breath with him. He did not know if he would survive the next 3,900 yards. He only knew that he had crossed farther than any scout before him, and that the German OP still did not know he existed. At 890 yards, the character of the field changed. The ground sloped upward, just enough to tilt the horizon, creating a shallow rise that exposed him more than before. Grass that had hidden him now thinned, baked under the unbroken Norman sun. The stalks stood shorter here, more brittle, less forgiving. Kessler felt it instantly. The pasture had shifted, and the advantage had shifted with it, toward the Germans. He pressed his chest flat, letting the mud seal him to the soil. The incline ahead was no more than 4 degrees, but 4 degrees was enough to turn an invisible shape into a detectable outline when viewed through Zeiss 10 by 80 lenses. He needed a new approach, something to compensate for the terrain's betrayal. The breeze returned, light, inconsistent. It brushed the grass unevenly, creating patches of motion that drifted across the field in irregular waves. Kessler studied those waves. Each gust lasted 3 or 4 heartbeats. Each pause held for 2. Movement synchronized to wind could disappear into natural patterns. He waited for the next ripple. When it came, he moved an inch. Not a foot. Not half a yard. An inch. The wind carried the grass in the same direction he crawled. When the breeze died, he stopped. When the breeze returned, he moved again. A man moving with wind was less visible than a man moving against it. At 900 yards, he felt the sun drying the mud on his face. Cracks formed across his cheek and jawline, tiny ridges that risked catching light. He pressed his face back into the wet earth, dragged a layer of black soil across his skin. The mud cooled him and muted any shine. He did the same to his forearms and helmet. A distant metallic click sounded from the German OP. He froze. Through thin grass, he saw the silhouette of a binocular operator adjusting his tripod. 2 MG-42 gunners shifted positions. A mortar crewman lifted a range chart. These were not signs of detection, yet. They were signs of vigilance, signs of men unstimulated by action, sharpening attention to break monotony. Bored soldiers were dangerous soldiers. Fresh eyes noticed things, tired eyes ignored. Kessler resumed only after a full minute passed. At 1,100 yards, he entered the portion of the field the company called the killing shelf. Every scout killed previously had died somewhere along this stretch. The ground flattened again, granting the OP a perfect downward angle. Crawling felt like moving under a magnifying glass. He tested a small motion. No response. He advanced 3 inches. No response. He extended an arm farther than intended, an instinctive, careless reach. And a flash of sunlight skated across his knuckles. The OP reacted instantly. 1 pair of binoculars snapped toward the reflection. MG-42 crews leaned forward. A whistle blast cut across the breeze. Just one. Clipped, sharp. Kessler's lungs collapsed inward. He sank into the earth, smearing mud across his exposed hand. The OP scanned the area aggressively now, sweeping methodically. The gun teams spread their bipod wider, adjusting angle. The mortar crew took firing positions. He had one reality to confront. The OP was now hunting something. They did not know what, but they knew something had momentarily broken the pasture's stillness. He needed misdirection. 10 feet to his right, a patch of ground shimmered. A spot where water had pooled earlier and evaporated unevenly, leaving a dark, reflective impression. He moved his hand slowly toward it, dragging a cluster of grass so the motion resembled wind displacement. He placed the grass onto the reflective patch, breaking its shine. The binoculars paused, then drifted on. The gun crews relaxed. The mortar man exhaled. Kessler had erased the anomaly. At 1,300 yards, he rediscovered an old logging camp lesson. Large movements kill, small movements live. He divided every action into micro-actions. A knee shift became 3 shifts. A shoulder drag became a sequence of glides. A breath became an opportunity to settle deeper into the earth. He imagined himself no longer as a man, but as a dark shape carried slowly by the pasture's natural drift. At 1,500 yards, something unexpected helped him. A flight of American P-43s roared overhead, heading east. The OP looked up. The MG crews shielded their eyes. For 8 seconds, the battlefield belonged to the sky, not the ground. Kessler moved nearly a full yard before the planes vanished. At 1,700 yards, the wind shifted direction. Instead of side-to-side ripples, it now pushed straight toward the German line. Grass leaned uniformly. Motion patterns became simpler, easier to mimic. But the wind brought a problem. It carried scent. Animals reacted to scent, humans less so. But scent changes brought insects, and insects created patterns. The flies that had settled around Kessler lifted, suddenly disturbed by dry gusts. A halo of movement rose from his body. He froze. If the Germans saw a ring of insects erupting from still grass, they might search its center. But the flies dispersed widely, not in a concentrated plume. They landed again in random distribution. The OP did not react. At 1,900 yards, he felt something shift inside himself. Not confidence. Confidence was a luxury, but adaptation. He was no longer simply crossing the pasture. He was blending with it, reading its moods, anticipating its turns. The field had learned his name, but he had learned its, too. And the hedgerow waited, still impossibly far, still the only place where an American flare could change the battle scheduled for 1,200 hours. He crawled forward again, slow, dark, and nearly invisible. He was halfway. At 2,100 yards, the pasture finally gave him something resembling hope. A shallow runoff channel carved by spring floods. It was no more than 5 inches deep, 6 inches wide, but depth did not matter. Depression mattered. Shadow mattered. Any deviation from the pasture's flat geometry reduced contrast through long-distance optics. Kessler eased himself into the trenchlet, letting the mud fill the joints of his uniform. The earth here was cooler, darker, more saturated. The channel snaked forward in a crooked line, not straight but workable, heading generally toward the distant hedgerow. He followed its course like water would follow gravity, slow, patient, unresisting. Above him, the German OP reoriented again. One MG-42 barrel depressed a few degrees. The binoculars swept a wider arc. Noon was approaching, and noon meant American preparations should be forming somewhere. The OP soldiers were not anxious. They were trained, disciplined. But routine carried tension of its own. Stillness before battle heightens perception. Men begin searching for the wrong thing because they expect the right thing. Kessler used that expectation. At 2,300 yards, a flock of starlings swept low across the field. The OP tracked them briefly, then ignored the movement. Birds were inconsequential. Birds crossed battlefields all day. Kessler timed his next 3 movements to coincide with the rise and fall of the flock's motion. When the wings beat dipped, he advanced. When the flock banked upward, he stopped. At this distance, synchrony was concealment. The runoff channel curved slightly left, forcing him to adjust his trajectory. The hedgerow remained a distant black line. Between him and it lay another stretch of exposed plain, flatter than before, more sunlit, less forgiving. But he studied its features with the same calm acuity he had used in Pennsylvania forests. Patterns decide survival, he thought. Break the wrong one, create the right one. At 2,500 yards, the ground shifted again. The channel ended abruptly where soil hardened into compacted pasture. No more trenchlet, no more shadow, just open exposure. He tested a single forward inch. Nothing from the OP. He tested 2. Still nothing. Then a new sound. The metallic scrape of a mortar base plate shifting position. He froze. Mortars meant suspicion. Mortars meant someone believed movement might occur soon. Mortars meant the Germans anticipated reconnaissance and expected it before the American assault. They were recalibrating firing tables, adjusting angles, preparing to blanket the pasture with high explosive if anything broke the monotony. Kessler let a full minute pass, then another, then one more. Only when the mortar crew relaxed did he resume. At 2,700 yards, the wind dropped entirely. Grass stilled, shadows sharpened, silence thickened. Without wind, every movement risked forming unnatural pattern. He needed a different tactic, something micro-incremental. He changed crawling technique. Instead of pushing with knees and toes, he anchored one elbow, rotated around it a fraction, settled, then anchored the other elbow. Inch by inch, alternating sides, moving in a pattern that mimicked the slow shifting of livestock bedding down rather than a man advancing. At 2,900 yards, flies gathered again, attracted to damp mud on his uniform. But instead of dispersing in a halo, they remained clustered, forming a dark blotch, indistinguishable from any patch of decaying vegetation. The OP did not react. Kessler's breathing slowed. His pulse steadied. His mind narrowed to distance, angle, timing. No fear. Fear was too large. The field allowed only small thoughts, the kind measured in inches rather than yards. At 3,100 yards, a problem emerged. A German patrol, 3 men, walked along the far hedgerow, checking wire, testing firing slits, observing American lines. They carried rifles at low ready. If they looked outward instead of inward, they could spot motion or contrast at half a mile. Kessler sank deeper into the mud, committing fully to immobility. The patrol halted. One soldier raised binoculars. Not large Zeiss observation models, standard infantry optics, effective but less powerful. If the soldiers scanned the pasture in a slow, deliberate sweep, Kessler would need absolute stillness. The man did exactly that. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The soldier paused on a sector near Kessler's position. A tiny shift, a microscopic angle change, and detection would be inevitable. Then the patrol leader tapped his helmet, gesturing them forward. The soldier lowered his binoculars. The patrol moved on. Kessler resumed. At 3,400 yards, the heat intensified. Noon approached. Mud dried faster now, forcing him to maintain sheen by dragging moisture from deeper soil layers. He lifted small clumps of saturated earth, crushed them in his hands, and smeared them across any brightening surface. At 3,600 yards, a gentle depression formed a natural dip. No deeper than 2 inches, but 2 inches concealed more than nothing. He slid into it and tested new angles. From here, the OP's visual cone narrowed slightly. Grass height increased, only marginally, but enough to distort outlines. He crawled faster, not recklessly, but decisively. At 3,800 yards, he reached the final obstacle before the hedgerow. A shallow drainage basin, dry now, but shaped like a bowl, that funneled visibility toward its center. Crawling through it meant exposure. Avoiding it meant detouring 18 yards to the left. Time he did not have. He chose the basin. Halfway through, the OP stirred again. A gunner sat upright, shading his eyes. The binocular operator leaned forward. Something had triggered suspicion, perhaps sun reflection, perhaps instinct sharpened by waiting too long for a fight. Kessler remained still. perfectly still. A long minute passed. Finally, the OP relaxed. Kessler climbed from the basin, his body shaking from the tension he refused to acknowledge. Only 400 yards remained, then 300, then 200. The hedgerow loomed close, dark, cool, alive. A place no American had touched in 3 weeks. He crossed the final 50 yards with the same calm consistency he had used since movement began. At last, he slid into the shadow of the hedgerow. He was through. But his mission had not yet begun. The field was only the first problem. Inside the hedgerows waited the second. The hedgerow swallowed him whole. Cool, damp air replaced the sun-baked heat of the pasture. Shadows layered upon shadows. Roots twisted beneath the soil. The world narrowed to a corridor of earth, leaves, and silence. Kessler paused just inside the foliage, letting his eyes adjust. The shift from open field to enclosed green was abrupt, almost disorienting. After hours measuring danger by distant optics, he now faced danger measured in feet, not yards. He stripped excess mud from his eyes, leaving only a thin film to dull any shine. The German patrol he'd seen earlier was still somewhere along this network of hedgerows, moving with the cautious rhythm of men expecting contact, but not yet receiving it. Kessler listened. He heard faint metal on wood, a rifle stock tapping a tree trunk, quiet conversation in low German, a match striking, the scrape of boots on packed soil. The patrol was to his right, perhaps 50 yards away, moving parallel to the hedge line. If they doubled back, they would find him. If they turned inward, they would intersect him. He kept to the left, following the hedgerow interior. He studied the ground the same way he studied maps. For clues, for patterns, for anything out of place. Each footprint mattered: shape, depth, direction. German boots left distinctive edges. American boots left a different imprint. The hedgerow floor told a story if read correctly. He advanced 6 steps, then 8 more, then stopped. A tripwire. It was faint, nearly invisible, stretched low across the path. German engineers used piano wire for tension, anchored to wooden stakes. The trigger likely led to a flare or a frag grenade mounted above eye level. A careless scout would catch it with a knee or rifle barrel and alert the entire perimeter. Kessler knelt, brushing soil lightly with the back of his hand. The wire was taut, recently placed. He followed its angle and found the explosive, a single steel granite positioned shoulder high behind a veil of leaves. He eased over the wire and continued. At 20 yards deeper, he saw the first German firing position, a shallow dugout braced with timber planks, 2 ammunition crates, 1 belt can for an MG-42. The gun itself was not present, likely relocated to the OP or loaned to a mobile fire team. He kneeled, memorizing layout. The dugout faced the pasture, not the inner hedgerow. Its blind spot was behind it. He passed through that blind spot. The patrol's voices grew louder now. They had turned into his corridor. Their boots crushed dead leaves with the steady cadence of men performing routine checks rather than active search. If they closed to within 10 yards, detection was almost guaranteed. Sound betrayed more readily than movement here. Even breathing seemed too loud. Kessler eased himself into a hollow between roots at the hedge's base, flattening his profile. He adopted the stillness he had practiced as a boy in Pennsylvania forests, watching deer pass within arm's reach. Eyes half-lidded, muscles slack, mind quiet. The patrol approached. 10 yards, 7, 4. He saw their boots first, hobnailed, soles, dried mud caked at the edges. The lead soldier carried his rifle at a casual low ready, muzzle drifting like a metronome with each step. The second soldier smoked, holding the cigarette away from his face to keep embers from betraying position. The third checked his watch, muttering about schedule. They passed directly beside him. 3 men, 3 rifles. Less than 2 yards between their footsteps and Kessler's concealed form. He did not blink. Not once. When they were 10 yards beyond him, he exhaled silently. The patrol's voices faded again to murmurs. Their direction shifted west, toward another intersection of hedgerows. He continued deeper. At 80 yards from entry, the landscape opened into a narrow junction where 3 hedge lanes met. From here, German command posts often placed relay runners, map tables, or dispatch messengers. Kessler scanned carefully. No visible soldiers, but 2 discarded ration tins suggested recent occupation. He crouched and examined the dirt. Fresh prints, 2 sets, heading southwest toward the village outskirts. He continued southwest. At 120 yards, he found what he was searching for: the German firing line covering the American assault's intended breakthrough point. 2 MG-42s emplaced under branch cover. Ammunition belts preloaded, empty ration tins stacked neatly. A field telephone wire snaked along the hedge base toward the OP. This was the critical data the assault needed: weapon placement, arc of fire, crew readiness. He counted fields of view. Left gun, 300 degrees of traverse. Right gun, 240. Both guns overlapped the pasture's center, exactly where the American infantry would emerge. The mortar impact zone reached 50 yards behind the guns, meaning if the Americans stalled here, they would be bracketed from front and rear. Kessler memorized everything: angles, distances, reload points, ammunition levels. Then he looked for a firing slit where he could launch the green flare. He found one, a narrow opening between 2 root clusters, perfectly angled upward, unseen from the OP. At noon, American commanders would be watching for that flare. Without it, the assault would not begin. With it, artillery would shift, smoke would deploy, infantry would advance across the same pasture he had crawled for hours. He steadied his breathing, raised the flare pistol, checked angle, checked again. He waited for the second hand on his wristwatch to reach the top. Then he pulled the trigger. A green comet punched through the hedgerow canopy. The Germans reacted instantly, shouted orders, boots scrambling, metal clattering. But Kessler was already moving. He had fired the signal. Now, he had to survive the consequences. The flare's trail had barely begun fading when the entire hedgerow convulsed. A German shout cracked across the lane, sharp, urgent, unmistakable. Metal snapped against wood. Rifle bolts slammed forward. Someone yelled, "Achtung! Aufklärer!" Another voice demanded confirmation. Orders tangled over each other as men tried to understand what they had just seen. A green signal rising from a sector they believed empty. Kessler did not wait for clarity to form on their side. Clarity meant death. He slipped deeper along the hedgerow interior, crouched low, moving with short, deliberate foot placements designed to mimic root pressure rather than human stride. The Germans reacted in predictable fashion. They fanned outward, hunting outward, following the logic that no American could have crossed the pasture by day. That logic pushed them toward the wrong conclusion. The infiltrator must have come from another hedgerow corridor. Kessler used that assumption. He shifted direction, not retreating toward the pasture he had crossed, but angling left toward a section of hedge where branches grew in dense vertical curtains. It offered concealment from rifles, but not from mortars. The first mortar round landed 8 seconds after the flare. An 80mm high-explosive shell slammed into the ground 30 yards behind him, throwing dirt and leaves like shrapnel. The second round dropped closer, a short walk of fire, an adjustment correction. German mortar crews were fast, disciplined, and lethal once they established a bracket. Kessler dove beneath a low overhang of intertwined root structures. The impact shook soil loose across his helmet. He counted quietly. 1, 2, 3, 4. The third round landed. Too far right. Good. They were overcorrecting. He crawled forward, hugging the root mass like a shield. Dirt stung his face. Splinters of wood snapped above him. The fourth round hit farther right still, widening their error. Somewhere behind him, German machine guns opened fire. Not aimed, but saturating. Fear fire, not fire discipline. The hedgerows amplified the MG-42's sound into a violent metallic roar. Bullets shredded leaves and bark, ripping through green darkness. Kessler pressed himself flat. He let the branches absorb the rounds rather than risking movement. He knew German counter-infiltration tactics. He knew they would search his original firing point first. He knew time was measured not in minutes, but in the handful of seconds before rifles and boots flooded every corridor. But he also knew this. The flare had done its job. American artillery answered. At 12:03 p.m., the first battery of 105mm howitzers fired from positions behind St. Lo. White smoke trails arced skyward. A distant thunder rolled across the open field. Then impact. Accurate, timed, devastating. The pasture erupted in brown geysers as shells struck the pre-plotted girds Kessler's commanders had held in reserve for 3 weeks. American gunners fired at the German firing line, not at the pasture. Their goal was suppression, not destruction. The hedgerow Kessler had infiltrated shuddered from concussive waves. German shouts shifted tone, from confidence to reaction. Kessler advanced. At 20 yards he found a narrow crosscut, a rabbit trail widened by infantry boots. The Germans would use it to reach firing positions. He listened. No one on it yet. He sprinted. Not long strides. Hedgerows punished long strides with noise, but tight forward bursts, boots barely lifting from the ground. He reached the far end of the crosscut just as a mortar section thundered back into action. Another German voice echoed, "Amerikanische Infantry, im Anmarsch." The assault had begun. Kessler glimpsed the pasture through a gap in the leaves. American riflemen advanced in staggered lines behind smoke shells. White-gray clouds rolled across the ground, masking silhouettes. The 2nd Infantry Division was moving, using the window he had opened. He turned back into the hedgerow interior. A German rifleman appeared ahead, 20 feet, maybe less. Moving fast, sweeping the corridor with a carabiner held tight against his shoulder. His face was red from exertion, breath sharp. He had heard something. Maybe Kessler's footfall. Maybe a shifting branch. Kessler flattened into the root mass, but the soldier kept coming. Drawn by instinct more than certainty. 10 feet, 8, 5. The soldier paused, squinting into the tangle of leaves. His rifle barrel lowered an inch, not from confidence, but from doubt. He listened. He frowned. Then distant American rifle fire cracked across the pasture, pulling his attention sideways. He turned. He ran toward the firing line. Kessler did not move until the sound of boots faded. At 200 yards from his entry point, the hedgerow floor pitched upward, forming a narrow exit path back toward the pasture. Not ideal. Exiting anywhere near German positions was suicide. But Kessler wasn't exiting toward them. He was exiting behind the Americans. He broke into the open ground, not the wide pasture he had crawled across, but a shallow notch shielded by rising smoke and bursting shells. American infantry were advancing through gaps carved by artillery. He raised both hands, mud-covered, helmet streaked black. A sergeant saw him. "Christ, where'd you come from?" Kessler answered only with a nod, conserving breath. He walked behind the advancing line, step by step, until he reached Captain Markham, who had been pacing anxiously, looking for the flare's origin. Kessler pointed toward the hedgerow he'd infiltrated. "Two MG-42s, he said. "Range is confirmed. Mortars pre-sighted, left flank open." Markham stared at him, at the mud, at the torn uniform, at the impossible fact that a man had crossed 3 miles of open ground at noon. "You did it," Markham said quietly. Kessler wiped mud from his eyes. "Field let me through," he replied. Then he turned and walked back into formation. One scout among many, disappearing into the smoke of a battle his crawl had unlocked. The pasture behind him smoldered, but it no longer owned the day.